BookTube. I'm Lori and welcome back to my channel Books, Ink, and Paper. And because it's October and because I love all things spooky and scary, I decided to participate in the horror tag. I thought about doing it a while ago and I said, nope, you know what, I'm going to wait until October. So this original tag was created by Hey Little Thrifter, so I will link her channel to this video so you can see the original tag. And there are 13 prompts in this tag, so there's a lot of things we're going to talk about today. This might be a long one. So the first question is, how and when did you get into horror? I would say that my initial real solid leap into horror, I was about 10 or so years old, and I read the book The Exorcist in my cousin's room one weekend when we were staying in Fort Wayne, Indiana at my aunt and uncle's. And he was much older than me and had the paperback version of The Exorcist in his room. I had heard about it and I knew it was really creepy and scary, and I really wanted to take a look. And since I was sleeping in his room, he was away for the weekend, I had a chance to just crack it open and see what I thought. And I was compelled to keep reading, so much so that I am ashamed to admit I lied about being sick and stayed in his room all weekend so I could finish the book before we left, and I did. So The Exorcist is pretty well known. I think it's an iconic horror novel that was later made into a movie adaptation starring Ellen Burstyn, and I'm trying to think of the name of the girl who played Regan. Linda Blair. Okay, anyway, this book follows Regan O'Neill and her mom, who have relocated to Washington, D.C. because her mom is an actress and she's filming a movie there, and they're living in a rental home in Georgetown. And Regan finds a Ouija board in the home and starts to tell her mom that she hears people talking to her through the Ouija board, and it just gets creepier and creepier and creepier after that. I love this movie. I love this book, and I reread it frequently. Yes, it freaks me out. Do I reread it all the time? Yes, I do. So for question number 2, what was the first horror book that you read? I would say that that one is the first that I remember being true horror. I used to read Nancy Drew and Sherlock Holmes and other mystery kinds of writers. So I had been reading, and I read Agatha Christie from a very young age too. So I've been reading a lot of murder mysteries, which are somewhat horrific for some people to read, but The Exorcist was my first foray into horror. Followed shortly by Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon, which I'm about to reread this month. And then as a teenager, I read the first Stephen King novel I'd ever read was Carrie, and I read that when I was about just 13. What horror-related goodness can we expect from your channel? So it's interesting that when I was doing this tag, I realized that I haven't read a lot of horror recently. There have been a few novels that I've read this year so far that would fit into that category. One that I really didn't like and expected that I would. But I don't read a lot of horror anymore. And I think one of the reasons for that is because I had a large collection of horror over the years that I had accumulated. And you may have heard me say this before in other videos, I lost a lot of books in Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And I just didn't replace a lot of them. So horror is the genre that is least represented on my shelves at the moment. So I'm really thinking about my goals already for 2020, and I think that I will increase that for this next year. But in the meantime, October will always be the month in which I feature horror. And I do read an occasional horror novel throughout the year, so you will see a bit of it sprinkled here and there this year, and then hopefully you'll see more of it next year. Do you have any favorite themes or subgenres within horror? I'm a big fan of possession horror, so that's always been, since The Exorcist, that's always one that sticks with me and that I enjoy. I also like any kind of an isolated house or isolated community horror novel. The Shining by Stephen King is one of my favorites, written by him. where they're contained in that home for a period of time. I like those kinds of things. I like ghost horror. I like ghost horror that is particularly creepy, and I like it to be really horrific. I don't like I don't like so much the books that are written where you think that there's a ghost and then it turns out there isn't. I really do like the ones where there's solidly some supernatural stuff happening. Name an overrated horror author or horror novel. I'm not a great fan of Anne Rice. Now, having said that, there are a few that I have enjoyed of hers, and I'm actually going to talk about them in my TBT for this month. But she's just okay for me. I read more of her novels, I think, when I was younger than I do now, but they're all kind of very similar. Recommend three of your favorite horror novels. So, The Exorcist is one for sure. I also like A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. I read that a year or so ago, maybe longer, and it is a possession type story. And possession, it's a novel about a possession of a young girl and her family. And I really was compelled to finish that one, and I like it a lot. And then Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin remains one of my favorites too. Lots of witchcraft in that one, lots of creepy, kind of an isolated house story because they're all in this apartment complex. And I've always liked both The Stepford Wives and Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin are two books that I have loved. They're kind of classic horror for sure, published a while ago. Recommend a book for someone who's new to the horror genre. That's interesting for me, and I'm not sure how comfortable I feel doing that because a lot of people like horror that is um, really in your face and really creepy, and some people like a little bit of softer horror. So I am going to recommend one that I think isn't, it's maybe kind of in the middle of the road, but it's been a while since I read it, so I might be wrong. But that is The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. It's a post-war novel, World War One novel, where the disparity between the classes is shifting. So the upper class is really struggling financially, and the middle class is rising into economic security. And it follows a man who goes to be a solicitor for a family in this home, and they're really struggling to keep their home and to be able to stay living in it. And he's known them since he was a child because his mom was their housekeeper. And when he starts to be there in the home with them and learn about what's happening with them, he also discovers that some other really creepy things are happening too. And I really liked it. I think I gave it 4 stars. I think all of us in my family liked it. Are there any book to film adaptations that you particularly loved or hated? So I did love The Exorcist. I thought that they did a very good job moving that one into a film um, adaptation of that novel. The sequels to The Exorcist, however, were highly disappointing. I also love The Silence of the Lambs. It was a novel by Thomas Harris. It remains one of my favorites too, and it was made into a movie. The first movie starred Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins, and I think that was by far the best of that series made. I was very disappointed when they replaced Jodie Foster in the second film. So they just kind of went down in enjoyability for me. But I do think that those movies are my favorite adaptations at this point. How do you discover new or new to you horror novels? So there's 3 ways, and probably this is how everyone does it. I do check out the sections in the bookstore that are devoted to horror. Some bookstores have a better horror selection than others, so it's sometimes hard to find a category where that is kind of upfront and clear to you, because they sometimes put them with mysteries or other thrillers, and or they're just intermingled in the shelves alphabetically. So that's a harder way to find them. I also search Goodreads and I look for lists of top horror novels. I look for recommendations by other people on Goodreads that I follow, and I look at what they're reading. And then finally, of course, I watch BookTube and I listen to people's TBRs, and I watch people who particularly enjoy horror, which, you know, is sometimes intermingled as mine is with other novels. But times like this, when there are horror tags and when there's October reads and different times of the year, you'll see a little bit more of that, and I really appreciate it. What was the last horror book that you bought? So the last horror book that I purchased is It by Stephen King, which I had read years ago when it first came out, and I enjoyed it enough. And when the movie came out, I wanted to reread it before I watched the movie. That didn't happen because it is pretty long and lengthy, and my daughter really wanted to see the movie soon while it was in theaters, so we went together. So I haven't completed the reread of It, but it is the last horror novel that I actually bought, and that was some time ago, because the movie It, the sequel, or well, not, I guess, is it a sequel, the new one? I'm not even sure, to be honest, but the one that I watched a year or two ago was pretty well done, actually, too. What horror book is at the top of your wish list? So my wish list to read right now is The Stand by Stephen King. You see there's a theme here, although I didn't really purposefully choose it as a theme. The Stand was one of the books I chose earlier this year as one of the top 9 I wanted to read in 2019. It is the third or fourth novel published by Stephen King, and I was at one time trying to read them all in order, so I purchased it. So it is in my October TBR, and it is my plan to finish that, so it's on the top of my wish list to read at the moment. I do also actually plan to read more H.P. Lovecraft, which some people don't consider to be horror, but it is, and that is kind of a wish list item for me, but probably in 2020. And then I also want to reread Dracula. I got a version of that on my Kindle that I think is annotated or illustrated, one of the two, I can't recall, but I haven't read Dracula since I was a young child, and that is definitely a book that I would like to read again as an adult and see how I feel about it, and if I feel differently about it than I did when I was young. But when I was young, I really loved it. It was one of my favorites. Future me here, and I'm popping in because I watched a BookTube video, Getting Hygge with It. April is one of my favorites, and she did a horror recommendation video this month. And one of the books she recommended is Come Closer by Sarah Gran. And it is a possession novel, and it is narrated by the woman who is possessed. So yeah, I'm going to add that to the list for sure. That's on my wish list very, very soon. She loved it. And then the 13th prompt is to tag some people, and I'm not going to tag anybody, but if you're watching this video, go ahead and consider yourself tagged. And if you do decide to create a horror tag video, just let me know so I can see what horror novels are special to you and what you're anticipating reading in the next little while. Thanks so much for joining me today. I haven't done a tag in a while, and I like tag videos. I like doing them. It just makes me think, and especially made me think about, in this case, the fact that I hadn't read a lot of horror in a while, and that I'm really only kind of saving it for October, and that seems, not necessarily fair to a genre that I grew up loving and that I read much more of until the last few years. I am so excited to see if you like this video, what your favorite horror is, if you have a BookTube channel, or if you don't, just go ahead and list your favorite horror novels in the comments below. Maybe you can even fill in the answers to these tag questions if you'd like. You certainly don't have to have a channel in order to participate, not in my mind anyway. I hope you're enjoying lots of creepy, twisty stories this October. And as always, happy reading. Bye.